Hey, I'm Greg Alba.
And I'm John Humphrey.
We're going to do a video that is a little bit different today. Actually, a lot different. We've never done something like this, but it should be a fun experiment. It should be interesting, and hopefully you guys find it intriguing. We have a top reward tier at our Patreon page. This one comes today from a man named Michael B. Omnimedia, whose channel is blowing up, by the way. He told me that he's finally going to get his first YouTube check. Major accomplishment.
Buddy.
Very cool.
Very cool.
Hells yeah, man.
That's what I'm talking about. Go check out his channel. He's seriously a wonderful YouTuber. So he basically said to us, I saw The Grudge 2020. In your words, as with Halloween 2018, why do you think studios are giving these movies the same names as the original films despite being sequels to those films? He was asking for like a podcast, and I haven't told him we're not doing the podcast. We're going to do something entirely different. It sort of became a springboard, a whole wide variety of thoughts of like, I wonder this and I wonder that. To answer your question, Michael B., it's just marketing. That's all it is. It's just brand name recognition. So many sequels are soft reboots now as opposed to just a part 2, you know?
That, and I think it increases your chances of accidentally putting the new one on the similar way that, like, streaming music will try and trick you into streams. So I wonder if maybe there's a certain element of trying to trick people into that view, but that's a conspiracy.
So I thought it'd be fun to do a comparison game. I wanted to look at the reception of each of these films and see which ones did better and or worse with critics and audiences. Since they both have the same title, but they're sequels, I just felt there'd be a fun comparison game. What we're going to do instead of using just our own personal opinion and doing some ranking system based off of that, we're going to use the number system behind Rotten Tomatoes, since that's where most people go. We're going to use the critics' percentage score, the audience score, but more importantly, we're going to use the average rating from both. That makes a bit difference, and it is a different type of variable here.
Specific user ratings.
If it sounds like it's going to be a little bit confusing, it'll be clear as we go. So to make things clear in this comparison game, we are only counting movies where it's easy to get confused. You know, movies like Halloween 1978 and Halloween 2018. They're not called that with the year in there. They're just called Halloween, so that they can be easy to get confused as to, like, is this a sequel? Is this a reboot? What is this? And we'll also be using movies that are pretty much the same title, but they took out words like the, like Fast and Furious and The Fast and the Furious, or when they just add like an S to it, like Alien and Aliens.
Or Predator and Predators.
So with that in mind, we're going to be excluding movies like Rocky and Rocky Balboa, as I feel like you can distinguish those two pretty well. Movies like The Blair Witch Project and Blair Witch, even though they share a lot of the same words, I feel like you can distinguish those pretty easily. And please do keep in mind, a lot of these are soft reboots that are technically a continuation, so they technically do qualify as sequels. And also to make this really clear, we're going by the overall score of each of these categories. None of these films have the same amount of people reviewing them, so we just wanted to get that out of the way. We're going by the scores. Yeah. So we have 13 franchises here. This is going to be fun. Most of these are just 2 movies each, but hey, let's get into this. The first one, since Michael B. brought it up, is 2004's The Grudge versus 2020's The Grudge. So 2004's The Grudge has a critic score of 39% and an audience score of 46%, with an average critic user rating 5.11 out of 10, audience score 3.07 out of 5 stars. Then when you compare that to 2020's The Grudge, it's a critic score of 19% and an audience score of 23%. The average user rating of that, of the critics, being 4.05 out of 10, with an average rating of audiences at 2.17 out of 5 stars. So this results in a 20% decline in critics and a 23% decline from audiences, with the critics user rating decreasing by 1.06 and an audience user rating decreasing by 0.9. So in conclusion, 2020's The Grudge is generally considered worse than a movie that was already not well received.
Yeah. On all counts. Which is a bummer, because the people I know who have seen it said it was actually kind of nifty and just overly reliant on jump scares, but you can't win them all.
Can't win them all. Number 2 that we have here is 1979 Star Trek versus 2009 Star Trek. Now, the asterisk to this one is 1979 Star Trek has the subtitle of The Motion Picture, but we're going to count it because, let's face it, they only put The Motion Picture there because there was a show on around that same time. So in order to differentiate it, they had to add the motion picture there, but most people just call it Star Trek. 1979 Star Trek versus 2009 Star Trek, and this is when it gets really fun. 1979 Star Trek has a critic score of 42% and an audience score of 42%. So they're tied. right there in the percentage score. And the average critic user rating is 5.72 out of 10. Average audience rating 3.09 out of 5 stars. Then when you compare that to the 2009 soft reboot, because of Spock and what they do with the timeline, it is a continuation. The critic score is 94%, and the audience score is 91%, with an average critic user rating of 8.13 out of 10 and an average audience rating 4.27 out of 5, which means, and I find this really funny, 2009 Star Trek did better by 52% with critics, 49% better with audiences. Average rating from critics, it did better by 2.41, average rating from audiences 1.18. It's pretty crazy because 2009 Star Trek, this soft reboot, is generally considered better by a much wider margin, which is, you can't say the same thing for Into Darkness and Wrath of Khan, but for this one, it did a better job.
Well, and yeah, it also was the first, reintroduction in a long time, and even though that movie I feel like does hold something of a contentious place, it does seem to be the most agreeable.
All right, John, give us one.
All right, well, I first started off by looking at Alien and Aliens. Alien 1979 has a critic score of 97%, with the audience down at 94%, and the average critic user rating was a whopping 9.07 out of 10, with the audience rating being 4.4 out of 5 stars. So both basically neck and neck, pretty much up at the top. And then Aliens, comparatively, rose with the critic score to 99%, and then the audience stayed around 94. Average critic user rating was 9.01 out of 10, which, funny enough, is slightly lower than the previous films, and the average audience rating was 4.45 stars out of 5 stars. So all this means that, got that extra 2% from the critics, while the audience just liked it steadily as much, at least as far as the percentages go, and then the average critic rating dropped 0.06%, and then the audience rose 0.05%.
So slightly, it was pretty much the same then.
Yeah. This one was, of all the ones I looked at, this was the most consistent, and the approval remained high across the board. In any place where one dropped or one increased, it kind of seemed to balance itself out, So yeah, Alien and Aliens is a good 1-2 punch.
Now let's look at 1978's Halloween versus 2018's Halloween. So 1978's Halloween, a classic in the horror films, and I think just regarded as a classic film. Critic score, a whopping 96%, an audience score of 89%, average critic user rating at 8.69, average audience rating at 4.33. Compare it to 2018's Halloween. Critic score at 79%, audience score at 70%, average critic user rating 6.78, average audience rating 3.68 out of 5 stars, which means 2018's Halloween did worse with critics by 17%, did worse with audiences by 19%. All things considered, for an official part 2 after so many years with a whole lot of movies in between, that's pretty good. That's pretty damn good. Because average ratings from critics only did worse by 1.91. Average user rating from audiences only did worse by 0.65. Even though 2018's Halloween was not as well received, it's still did pretty damn good amongst audiences and critics, all things considered.
As far as the drops go, and as for however many years passed between them, it's pretty decent, I would say. And especially with the status that Halloween holds, being a potential kneecap for people who are purists.
Yeah.
Because that's something I feel like you have to factor in with a lot of these soft reboots. And speaking of soft reboots, let's look at The Evil Dead 81 and Evil Dead 2013.
I do want to establish, though, we did do some research on this to make sure we were right, because every report of it said that it does ultimately serve as a soft reboot. It's still technically a continuation. That's at least how the filmmakers were approaching it.
Yeah, and I feel like there are little nuggets like Ash's car and the fact that there is an Easter egg Bruce Campbell, cameo. So yeah, they seem to be at least touching the same world, and we know that Evil Dead exists with universe hopping and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, soft reboot sequel thing. So the original film, The Evil Dead, has a critic score of 95% with an audience score of 84. So, the audience aren't as hot on it. Average critic user rating is 8.04 out of 10. Average audience is 4.09 out of 5. Pretty similar, when you think about it. Evil Dead 2013 then has a critic score of 62. Audience is a little higher on it, 63%. And then the average critic rating was 6.16 out of 10. Average audience rating was 3.54. So we see some drop. I mean, definitely Evil Dead is another one of those classics. This was a markedly different approach. So we saw 33% of a drop from critics between the OG and the reboot, while the audience score only dropped 21%. So, again, the audiences are slightly higher than the critics throughout this one. Average critic rating fell 1.88 points, and the average audience score ratings fell 0.055.
Oh, so in terms of
0.55, sorry. Yeah.
So if it only fell that much, that's actually, from in terms of an audience perspective, that's pretty good.
Yeah, it's pretty decent.
That's why the user ratings are important to factor in here.
Yeah, and the reboot also had more than 3 times the amount of critics reviewing it, and I did a vague amount of math on that, and even though there is a higher overall, there is a higher percentage of negative middling responses than there was to the original film if you crunch that number, and less than half the amount of the users reviewed the reboot as reviewed the original, which I thought was interesting. So yeah, that's something too, is you get a whole different amount of people each time.
All right, so let's look at 2000's Final Destination versus 2009's The Final Destination. So 2000's Final Destination, which is a film I actually quite liked when I was 10 years old, got a critic score of 34%.
Hey, man.
Started off strong in his franchise.
But looky here.
But the audience score is 68%, and
Double.
an average critic user rating 4.72 out of 10, average audience rating 3.66. Comparatively, 2009's The Final Destination, which was not in fact The Final Destination, got a critic score of 29% and an audience score of 35%. So the average critic user rating is 4.23, average audience rating 2.81, which means 2009 film did worse marginally with critics by only 5%, but with audiences 33%. Average critic user rating did worse by 0.49, average audience rating did worse by 0.85. All things considered, though, even though 2009's Final Destination numbers saw a decline, generally similar in numbers, even though there's a lot of installments in between, they're generally similar.
It seems like the critics aren't so much about it, and audiences think they're all right. Yeah. All right, moving on to The Fast and the Furious was the next one I did. The Fast and the Furious 2001, and then Fast and Furious in 2009, dropping those thes. The critic score for the original film was 53%, and the audience score was much higher at 74%. And then the average critic user rating was 5.37 out of 10, 3.85 out of 5 from the audience.
That's a great audience score.
Yeah, when you think about it, you see that 3 and you're like, oh, it's all right, but it's very close to 4. So then you look at Fast and Furious 09, you have a 29% critic score, a 67% audience score. Again, the audience is much more enthusiastic. Critic rating is 4.57 out of 10. Audience rating generally is 3.71 out of 5. So, there's a little bit of drop. Critical, you had a 24% drop from 01 to 09. Audience score only drops about 7%, which is decent.
Yeah.
And then the average critic rating dropped 0.8 points out of 10, and audience dropped more, but still small, 0.14 out of 5 stars. It's a crowd pleaser. The critics have never been really high on this. The drop is very much more drastic among the critics than the audience.
All right, so here we go. We got 2002's The Ring versus 2017's Rings. So 2002's The Ring, and I was actually surprised to learn about the audience score on this one. The critics score was 71%, which is really good for a horror film, especially at that time.
Yeah.
And the audience score, I was surprised by how low it was. 48%, not even certified fresh. Average critic user rating 6.61 out of 10. Audience 2.97 out of 5 stars. And you compare that with Rings, which was a box office behemoth. 2017's Rings had a critic score of 8% and an audience score of 23%. So average critic user rating out of 10 was 3.19. Average audience rating out of 5 stars, 2.35. 2017's Rings did worse with a 63% decline from critics, 25% decline from audiences. User rating did worse from critics by 3.42. User rating did worse from audiences by 0.62. So that's a pretty big drop, especially in the terms of critics. When you factor in the average audience score, no, not so much, but immensely inferior in terms of the critical department.
Yeah, well, and one thing I've noticed too is that when you look at the critic rating and the user rating, often if you double the user rating, you essentially get the out of 10 score. And so it's interesting to see how neck and neck those numbers can be. And when one is significantly higher than the other, like in that last example, the critics dropped significantly more than the audience. I do find that interesting.
Well, there's always more audience members than critics too, So I think that's actually, in a lot of ways, a little bit more of a reliable number.
Yeah. Let's move on to a monster movie now. We got Godzilla or GOJIRA, the original 1954 film, and then the beloved 1985 sequel of the same name.
Yeah, so keep in mind, because some people might be like, it's easy to look at this and go, Roland Emmerich, or the Godzilla one by Gareth Evans. Edwards, my bad. The second I said it, I was like, I think I'm wrong.
Gareth Evans needs to make it, though, like a raid-style fist fight, Godzilla.
This Godzilla 85 is actually a sequel, whereas those other ones are straight-up American remakes.
Reboots. So the first original film has a critic score of 93%, audience score tad bit lower at 89, and then the average user rating for critics was 7.67 out of 10, pretty high. Average audience rating was even higher, 4.29 out of 5.
See, that's what I mean about those audience ratings and audience scores. Like when you see the audience score for 89%, they're like, oh, below 90, but 4.29 out of 5 sounds higher than 89%.
Yeah. It's funny to see how the percentage scores and the average ratings differ, because sometimes you look at them and you're like, well, by the average rating, this is actually rating lower or higher or whatever. But moving on to the 85 sequel, we got a critic score of 20%. Audience is up at 66, 3 times plus better. Wow. Average critic user rating was 2.81 out of 10. Glowing. Average rating from the audience was 3.66 out of 5. This one saw a very sharp drop from critics. Their score plummeted 73%, and audiences only dropped 23. So again, you're looking at like a 3 times difference. And the average critic ratings dropped 4.86 points out of a possible 10, only 0.63 drop out of 5 for the audience. Wow. So even if you double that, it's still less of a drop than the critics by a wide whole number margin. So it's safe to say that most everybody prefers the original film. The audiences were a bit kinder and a bit more open to the newer, 85 sequel. Seems to have kind of a meh to decent response at best. And of all the films that I looked at, this one was the harshest drop amongst critics.
So what I did was I came up with this idea for the video, and I gathered all the images of the ratings, but I didn't actually do the comparison numbers. But John did this one for the Muppet movie. I'm going to read this for the first time to see what the actual rating is on this. You got the Muppet movie 1979, then you got the Muppets 2011, and I kind of feel like it's a similar situation like what we said with Star Trek the movie and Star Trek. So the critic score on the Muppet movie is 79, was 88%, audience score 88%. Wow, that is exactly the same. Average critic user rating 8.02 out of 10, average audience rating 4.19 out of 5. You compare that to the 2011 The Muppets. Whoa, it has a higher critic score, huh?
It does.
Okay.
And a lower audience score.
Wow. So 95% critic score, 80% audience score. So critic score actually rises 7% here, while the audience score drops by 8%. Fascinating. I didn't see that coming.
Yeah, there are a lot of...
I was just gathering all the images, but I wasn't really paying attention to So the average critic rating drops 0.09 points out of a possible 10. Average audience rating drops 0.2 star points out of 5.
So that's a harsher drop for audiences there.
Okay.
But yeah, both are pretty well liked, with the 2011 films receiving basically just a smidge more critical love. Though the percentages drop, and both user ratings due to the audiences are still technically a little higher in the user ratings department. So I found that interesting.
John, take this one, man. This is your movie.
Yeah, The Thing. So we got John Carpenter's original 1982 film, and then we have the reboot prequel from 2011 of the same name. Critic score for John Carpenter, 82 is 84%. Audience score is 92%. Average critic user rating, 7.39 out of 10, 4.33 out of 5 from the audience. Comparatively, we got 35% from the critics for the reboot prequel, 42% from the audience.
That is not good.
Yeah, we got a 5.02 out of 10, almost right in the middle from the critics on user ratings, and 3.08 out of 5 from the audience. There's a lot of drop. This was almost both of them. I mean, critics dropped 49%, audiences dropped the full 50%, which is a pretty significant drop for this. Ratings from critics dropped 2.37 points out of 10, 1.25 star points out of 5 from the audience, which would be technically, again, a higher fall than the critical if you double it. The conclusion I drew here, was that the 2011, like, the thing I found funny about this was that the 2011 film has less fresh reviews than the entire number of reviews there were for the first film. Like, there were only 60-odd something reviews for that film, and out of however many the new one got, not even that many were positive. So this had the sharpest audience drop of all the movies I looked at, and everyone seems to prefer John Carpenter's movie.
All right, now here's where it gets a little bit tricky. So the number reveal system system will be a little bit different here because these next two movies are 3 movies
Oh, triples.
each. So this one is 1971 Shaft versus 2000's Shaft versus 2019's Shaft, which culminates all the shafts right there. Okay.
They could have called it Shafts.
They might as well have.
Should have.
All right, but this one's actually really interesting to me. You'll see when we get to 2019. 1971 Shaft has a critic score of 88%, an audience score of 68%. So the average critic user rating 7.47, average audience rating 3.64. 2000's Shaft. With Christian Bale as the villain. Critic score, 67%. Audience score, 41%. That's pretty low. Average critic user rating, 6.09. Average audience rating, 3.07. Now, here's where this gets really interesting. 2019 Shaft has a critic score of 31%. That's the lowest of them all. But its audience score is the highest of them all, a 94%. So, talk about a divisive movie. Average critic user rating, 4.58. Average audience rating, 4.58.
Wow, and one of those is out of 10 and the other is out of 5. Yeah. Which is such a disparity. That's awesome. That's great.
So the stack list goes like this. I'll flash it on screen here. The Shaft from the critics, you'll see it goes from 88% down to 31. And then from audiences, there's a pretty big gap there. So from Shaft 1971 to Shaft 2019, 22% higher on the audience score rating. Average critic user rating, you can see right here, average audience user rating, Shaft 2019 beats them all. So strangely, in the scoring of these films, 2019 Shaft undoubtedly scored the highest amongst the audiences. So take from that what you will. And then the last one we have here, 1987's Predator versus 2010's Predators versus 2018's The Predator. If you just looked at most of the posters that are in the 1987's Predator, it will all look like they're the same movie. So make sure to gather some different posters. John, what's 1987's Predator?
1987's Predator sits at 81% from the critics and a 87 from the audience. Average critic user rating is 7.1 out of 10. Average audience is 4.13 out of 5.
And then the 2010's Predators.
I like it.
Which we both like. Critics score
fresh.
65%, so that's fresh. Audience score 52%. That one I'm actually pretty surprised to see that the critic score is higher than the audience score on that one. I'm pretty surprised. Definitely see more like a crowd would love it, but critics wouldn't. Average critic user rating 5.83. Average audience rating 3.27. And here's the fun one. 2018's The Predator. Critic score 32%. Average the audience score 34%. Average critic user rating 4.88 out of 10. Average audience rating 2.61. Lower. So here it is from the critics. You'll see a big decline from 1987's Predator to The Predator.
Steadily.
And then audiences, pretty similar number in decline when you look at from the audience score. The critics was 81% and 32%. 1987's Predator, the first one, 87%. The Predator, 34%. Average critic user rating, you can see the drop here. Average audience user rating, big drop. So in my opinion, considering the amount of decline this franchise has experienced, maybe it is time to just let the franchise die, even though I think Predators is rather underrated and deserves a little more praise or perhaps a second viewing. But in terms of scoring, from doing this comparison list of the sequels or soft reboots that share the same title, there's only one movie here that definitely did better in terms of scoring, overall reception from audiences and critics, and that is Star Trek.
Yeah.
That's the only one. Aliens, we almost put here, but
They're both good.
They're pretty much equal. There's like a point percentage difference, but literally out of all these movies that share the same title, for the most part, Star Trek is the only one.
Yeah, that saw a soaring increase in approval, yeah. And it's funny, I mean, because this is such a conversation that we have even more nowadays about like, critics and audiences being detached. It's funny to watch the ups and downs of it all, because more often than you would expect, they're kind of side by side, it appears.
Yeah.
Or even when the percentage rating, doesn't quite match, oftentimes the user ratings will be a little less drastic or a little closer together or something like that.
Yeah.
So there's not as much of a difference, unless you're a Shaft fan, between critics and audiences.
All right, guys. Well, what'd you think of this video? Which one of these comparisons surprised you the most? Just leave your thoughts down below. Don't ask us to crunch the numbers on remakes because we
There are too many.
Spent a whole month comparing the numbers, and now this video is 8 hours long.
We did every remake.
Every remake, foreign language films included.
No, we can do that. We can do like a live stream for 48 straight hours, just going over all the numbers.
We'll have to narrow it down to like, here are the remakes that did perform better. You know?
Yeah. Maybe a stable of 20.
Dan Merle has Charting with Dan for the box office numbers, and we'll monitor Rotten Tomatoes and audience scores.
Yeah, we have approval ratings here.
All right. Well, thank you, Michael B., for asking me this question, which springboarded this topic.
Yeah.
Appreciate it, buddy. Guys, seriously, check out Michael B.'s channel, Omni Media, doing a lot of reactions and a lot of reviews of some of your favorite pop culture things out there. Great geekdom stuff he covers. And he's a lot more knowledgeable than us. He will surpass us in viewers in no time. Subscribe to The Real Rejects. Click that notification bell to get notified whenever we got a new YouTube video up. If you like more of these discussion-type videos or strange analysis videos, I haven't seen anyone do this kind of video, so I was like, here's our opportunity to try something out. But if you like this kind of video and you want some more stuff kind of like this, let us know in the comment boxes. Much love. Thank you, guys.